They said Father Alcott was a man of God, but the altar he built was not for worship. Beneath it, the earth still breathes. As if holding something down, parishioners swore they felt a pulse beneath the stone. As they knelt to pray, and when the church was condemned, they found a grave beneath the altar, but no one will say whose name was carved into the lid. The road to St. Avitus Parish was narrow, lined with birch and pine in the winter. When the snow was deep, the trees leaned over the path, bowing under the weight. In the summer, the dirt turned to mud, and boots sank, leaving prints that filled with water. The church itself was small, white clapboard, a narrow steeple, windows cut like thin wounds into the walls. To the people who lived in the nearest town, 7 miles east, it looked like any other New England parish, a place where weddings might be held, where families might gather on Sundays. But those who lived closer, the farmers, the woodsmen, the few scattered families whose homes sat along the winding road, they knew it was different. The ground was wrong. No one had ever managed to grow anything near St. Avitus. Even the wild grass grew in stunted clumps, brittle and gray by mid-August. Graves dug for the small churchyard had collapsed twice, the soil swallowing caskets before they could be lowered fully into place. And yet, Father Alcott insisted it was holy ground. He said the land was a gift, that God had led him to it, away from the bustling cities, away from the distractions of the world, to a place where faith could be tested and refined. But the parishioners, they felt something else. Some said they could hear faint sounds under the earth when they walked the grounds, a deep, hollow hum that rose and fell like breath. Others claimed the air tasted metallic there, sharp on the tongue, as though the soil exhaled something unnatural. And then there were the story's one family. The Corwins had tried to plant a row of apple trees along the property line, hoping to sell fruit to the churchgoers who passed each Sunday. By the following spring, every tree was dead. Their roots had withered, blackened as if burned, though there was no sign of fire. The Corwins moved within the year. They left behind a note nailed to their empty farmhouse. The ground doesn't want us here. Still, Father Alcott stayed. Had been transferred from a parish in Boston 5 years earlier, a quiet man, pale, with thinning hair and hands always clasped at his waist. His sermons were brief, delivered in a voice that never rose above a soft, even cadence. He seemed calm, measured, but those who attended St. Avitus noticed things Alcott rarely looked anyone in the eye. His gaze lingered instead on the floorboards during Mass, as though watching something move beneath them. He kept the church doors unlocked at night, and more than one passerby claimed to see light flickering through the windows at impossible hours once. In the early months after his arrival, a group of teenagers walking home from a dance swore they saw him kneeling outside in the grass, hands pressed into the soil, whispering into the earth as though listening for an answer. He denied it when asked. He laughed softly, as if amused by their curiosity, but his smile didn't last, and something about the land kept shifting. The churchyard fence, once a simple wooden barrier, leaned inward over time, as though the posts were being pulled toward the foundation. Stones placed as markers in the yard tipped and sank. The path to the front steps, made of brick, buckled in places as the earth below settled unevenly. Visitors said they could feel it when they walked the grounds, a subtle pull, like standing over a cavern, the sense that the soil was not solid but hollow, holding something deep below. And yet, Mass continued, weddings were performed, confessions were heard, children baptized, but something wasn't right. One Sunday in early October, a woman named Eleanor Harrow collapsed just outside the church after service. Witnesses said her lips were moving as though she were trying to speak, but no sound came. When she was carried inside, she began to convulse, her hands clutched at the floorboards, nails tearing at the wood, as if she were trying to dig through them. By the time the local doctor arrived, she was gone. Cause of death unknown. The next day, the boards where she had clawed were replaced. Father Alcott oversaw it himself. He burned the old planks behind the rectory late at night. though the wood was still wet from the previous evening's rain, and no one spoke of it again. The locals began attending less. Some chose to travel farther, to other parishes in the county. Others simply stopped attending Mass altogether, muttering that St. Avitus was not built for them. The church was left to those few who still believed, or perhaps those who feared what might happen if they left, because by then, strange things were being whispered. Farmers claimed they heard movement under the ground at night, like a slow shifting, heavy and deliberate. A hunter swore he saw a depression forming in the earth behind the church, as if something large had sunk just beneath the surface. And on windless nights, the bell in the steeple would sway, not enough to ring, just enough to creak. Father Alcott remained undisturbed. He told the congregation that faith was not found in comfort, but in endurance, that the earth, though hostile, had been chosen for a reason, that some places, though feared, were necessary for the soul's purification. His sermons grew shorter, his presence quieter, and yet his hands trembled more often, even as his voice never wavered. One night, near the end of that year, a traveling merchant passing through the woods stopped on the road. He swore he heard singing, not hymns, something older, something lower, rising from beneath the soil. When he turned to look toward the church, the lights were out, the windows dark, but he could see Father Alcott standing by the altar inside, motionless, staring at the floor. The merchant didn't stay. He left before dawn, without collecting payment for his supplies, and refused to travel that road again. By the following spring, 3 more families had left the area. Their homes stood empty, shutters loose, roofs sagging. Only the church remained, pristine and untouched, as though the land itself refused to swallow it. But those who still lived nearby, they began to notice something else. The air around St. Avitus no longer smelled metallic. It was sweeter now, almost floral, and that's when they realized the earth wasn't rejecting what was buried there anymore. It was accepting it, the sanctuary. At night was never truly dark, even when the candles were out and the oil lamps were drained. There was a glow, not bright enough to see, by just enough to catch on the edges of the altar, to glint faintly off the brass cross that hung above it. Father Alcott was often seen moving through that glow. The few who passed the church after midnight, a farmer walking home from his fields, a pair of hunters returning from the woods, swore they saw him pacing the nave, slowly, deliberately. Sometimes he carried a candle, but the wick was unlit. Sometimes he carried nothing at all, his hands folded behind his back, his steps soundless on the old wooden floor. And sometimes they swore they could hear him speaking low murmurs, words they couldn't quite make out, drawn out, steady, like a prayer. But the sound didn't come from him, it came from beneath the altar. The first to hear it clearly was Martin Oakes, a miller whose path home took him past St. Avitus 3 nights a week. He stopped outside one evening, drawn by the faint flicker of movement through the stained glass. He pressed his ear to the wooden door. Listening at first, there was only the creak of the building, settling, the sigh of the trees swaying in the wind. And then, voices, not one, several, all murmuring at once, in a language Oakes didn't know. The words didn't overlap, but rose and fell together, like a practiced chant, and beneath them, something heavier, a single, long exhale. He stepped back from the door, his heart pounding, but the voices stopped. The glow inside dimmed, and Father Alcott opened the door. The priest's face was calm, his expression blank, his posture almost too still. He asked Oakes if he needed assistance, his tone gentle. When the miller stammered about the voices, Alcott tilted his head slightly. "There is no one here but me," he said, and then he closed the door. By morning, Oakes told no one what he'd heard, but others would over the months that followed. Several parishioners reported strange sounds during their visits. A widow named Claire Beckett claimed she came to pray one evening and heard what she described as breathing beneath the floor. When she told Alcott, he simply placed a hand on her shoulder, bowed his head, and told her to pray louder. Another man, a traveling merchant who stopped in St. Avitus for shelter, claimed he woke in the rectory one night to find Alcott standing at the window, staring toward the church. The priest's lips were moving, but no sound emerged. The merchant asked what he was saying. Alcott didn't answer. He only raised a finger, pressing it to his lips, and continued to whisper silently to the glass. The merchant left before dawn, abandoning half his wares, and still the nightly walks continued. The glow in the sanctuary windows was seen more often, sometimes faint, as if from a dying flame, sometimes sharp, like a single beam of moonlight caught on metal. No one dared enter the church at night, except a young farmhand named Isaac Platt, restless from the stories, decided to see for himself. One night, as a storm gathered on the horizon, he slipped into the churchyard and pushed open the unlocked doors. The air inside was thick, heavy, as though the storm had already arrived. He crept down the aisle, his boots barely making a sound on the worn boards. The sanctuary was empty, the candles unlit, but there was a sound, a low murmur, distant yet clear, like water flowing over stones. It came from the altar. Platt crouched, pressing his hand to the floor. The wood was cold, colder than it should have been. The murmuring grew louder, words that seemed to rise and fall in patterns, though he couldn't understand them. His breath fogged in the air as he knelt closer, ear to the floorboards, and then he heard out a whisper, sharp and clear, a single word, Isaac. He stumbled back, heart pounding, eyes darting around the sanctuary. There was no one there. The murmuring stopped, the air warmed, and Father Alcott appeared in the doorway, his pale face calm, his expression unreadable. "Why are you here?" he asked softly. Platt stammered, trying to explain, but the words caught in his throat. The priest stepped closer, the hem of his cassock brushing the floor. "Whatever you heard?" Alcott said, his voice still low. "You must forget." He led the farmhand out into the night, his hand resting lightly on the young man's shoulder. Platt never returned to St. Avitus years later. When the church was abandoned, Alcott's journals were found in a locked chest beneath the rectory floormost, were filled with ordinary notes, records of sermons, lists of parish expenses, brief reflections on the weather. But in the final book, written in a hand that grew shakier with each page, there were other entries, short sentences, fragmented thoughts. Voices again tonight louder. "They know my name. Under the stone they want out." The last entry was written in a thin, uneven scrawl. "If they stop whispering, it means they're listening." No one knows how long Father Alcott remained in the parish after that. The official records show no resignation, no transfer, no burial, only that sometime in the winter of 1894, the doors to St. Avitus were locked from the inside, and no one saw him again. But the locals said the glow in the sanctuary windows never stopped, not once, even after the candles were all gone. And that's when they began to realize, whatever whispered beneath the altar, Father Alcott wasn't praying to silence. He was answering it. The marble altar of St. Avitus was heavy. It sat like a stone heart at the center of the sanctuary, its edges worn smooth by years of hands brushing. Past it, the white surface caught what little light filtered through the narrow windows, giving it a faint, cold glow even in the deepest hours of the night for most. It looked permanent, fixed, unmoving, but not to those who stayed late enough to see it. The first to notice were the choir boys. It had been a late practice on a windless winter evening. The sanctuary was still, their voices echoing softly against the wooden beams. As the last notes of the hymn faded, one of the boys, Thomas, only 12 years old, froze. He swore he saw the altar shift, not slide, not tilt, rise as though something beneath it had inhaled, lifting it barely an inch, before settling again. The others laughed at him, told him it was his imagination, but when they turned to leave, they all heard a sound low and hollow like air moving. Through a space that shouldn't exist, they ran, left their hymnals behind him. They didn't tell Father Alcott, not at first, because the altar kept moving, not every night, not even every week, but often enough that those who practiced in the evenings, the boys, a few members of the choir, even the occasional caretaker, began to whisper about it. They said it looked alive, like a lung rising and falling in a rhythm, It didn't match any breath they knew. And worse, there were the moments when the movement would stop, and something else would happen dust-thin, gray, almost like ash, drifting upward through the faint cracks where the marble met the wooden floor. It never came in a gust, never enough to coat the room, just a few specks, weightless, spiraling toward the ceiling before disappearing into the air. A deacon, Elias Crane, witnessed it one evening as he prepared the sanctuary for a morning mass. The candles were all out. The air was heavy, silent, almost expectant, and then he saw at the altar shifted slowly, a fraction of an inch upward, then back down. The sound that followed was worse, not a creak, not a groan of settling wood, but a faint, deliberate scrape, as though something beneath the floor had stirred. Crane backed away, knocking over the basket of altar linens he carried. The fabric spilled across the floor as he stumbled toward the door. And that's when Father Alcott stepped from the shadows near the confessional. His face was calm. His hands were folded. "You must not touch it," he said softly. Crane, shaken, asked if the priest had seen it move. Alcott's gaze didn't waver. "It must not be disturbed," he repeated, and then, without another word, he extinguished the last of the sanctuary lamps and locked the doors. From that night on, no one entered the church alone after dusk. But the altar didn't stop. Those who passed by in the evenings swore they heard faint noises through the walls. A rhythm slow like a measured inhale. One of the older choir boys, Daniel, began to write about it in his journal. His entries, later found abandoned in a trunk when his family moved away, grew more frantic over time. "It moves when no one is near. It sounds like it's listening. I heard something beneath, like a hand on the stone." The other boys begged him to stop talking about it. Some even refused to return to practice, claiming the sound followed them home, faint but constant, echoing in their rooms at night. And still, Father Alcott forbade anyone to speak of it publicly. When confronted, he would only say the same words: "It must not be disturbed." No one knew why. No one dared ask again, but those closest to the church began to change. Elias Crane, the deacon, stopped sleeping through the night. His neighbors noticed him standing outside his home at odd hours, staring toward St. Avitus. Sometimes he held a lantern, though it was never lit when pressed. He admitted he couldn't rest, he said. He felt vibrations in his chest when the altar moved even miles away. In his own bed, he swore he could feel the faint rise and fall, like something beneath the parish was drawing air through the earth. And he wasn't the only one. Several parishioners, those who lived nearest, began waking at the same time, each night, always at 3, always with a start, their lungs burning, as if they'd been holding their breath. Some said it felt as though the ground itself had taken it from them. By the end of that winter, only a handful of people still attended evening services. The others chose to come only during daylight, their prayers quick, their eyes avoiding the altar entirely. But the movement didn't stop. If anything, it grew more frequent. A caretaker, Samuel Dent, claimed he once saw the marble slab tilt ever so slightly, as if something beneath it had shifted its weight. He described a faint crackling sound, like dried leaves being crushed, rising from below the floorboards. When he told Alcott, the priest placed a hand on his arm and whispered, "If it rises again, leave, do not look, do not speak, just leave." Dent quit the next morning, and yet, despite the fear, no one removed the altar. No one even attempted to look beneath it, because every time someone thought to try, Father Alcott was there, his pale face in the doorway, his calm voice repeating the same words: "It must not be disturbed," and for reasons no one could name. Those words were enough, even as the dust continued to drift upward through the cracks, even as the marble continued to rise and fall, slow and steady, like the measured breath of something deep below, until one night, in the first thaw of spring, the movement stopped entirely. The choir boys, returning for their first evening practice in months, noticed the stillness immediately. The sanctuary was cold, the air heavy, the altar sat silent, unmoving, relieved. They began to set out their hymnals, and that's when they heard it. Not a breath, not a scrape, but a knock 3 times, slow, from somewhere beneath the marble. The boys fled, leaving their books scattered across the pews. When they told Father Alcott, expecting anger, his expression remained unreadable. He simply nodded once and locked the sanctuary doors behind him. No one knows what he did inside, only that when the church reopened the next morning, the marble bore a new mark near its base, a thin, cracked, jagged dark, like something had pressed against it from below. Though the altar did not move again that week, those who entered claimed they still heard it not rising, not falling, just waiting. The sanctuary of C. Avitus was still lit when dusk bled into night. The windows caught the last traces of the sun, casting fractured shards of orange light across. The floor, the smell of candle wax lingered in the air, heavy and sweet, mingling with the faint chill that always rose from the ground beneath. It had been a quiet evening. The choir had finished. Evensong just after sunset, 7 voices, rising and falling beneath the wooden beams, their hymns soft and measured. The echoes of their notes clung to the rafters even as the boys gathered their coats and filed out into the darkening yard. The church was empty by the time the final bell was struck, or so they thought. An hour later, Thomas Keller, the sexton, passed by the parish on his way home. The road was silent, the air still, but as he neared the churchyard, he heard it singing 7 voices clear, perfectly in tune. The same hymn the boys had sung that evening, now slower. Drawn out, the pauses longer. Keller stopped. His breath caught in his throat. He could see no light through the windows, no movement through the glass, and yet the voices carried low, steady, as if coming from deep within the walls. He tried the doors. They were unlocked. The wood groaned softly as he pushed them open inside. The sanctuary was dark. The candles had long since burned out. Their wicks curled into ash. The faint smell of smoke lingered, but the air was colder than it should have been, and the singing stopped. Keller stepped inside, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. The silence pressed close, thick, almost physical. He called out no answer, but something wasn't right. The air felt heavy, too still, a kind of stillness that feels deliberate, as though the room itself is waiting for something. Keller lit his lantern. Its faint glow reached the altar. The marble slab stood silent, a pale shape in the darkness, and then he saw them, footprints, 7 pairs, small, narrow, pressed deep into the dust along the aisle. They led from the doors toward the altar, but there were no prints leading back. Keller crouched to examine them, the lantern's light shaking in his hand. The impressions were fresh, too fresh. Some still held the faintest trace of moisture, as though left only minutes before he called out again, his voice quieter now still. No reply. His gaze lifted to the altar. The marble surface caught the flicker of the lantern, a faint glint along the jagged crack near its base. The air grew colder, and that's when he heard a sound. Not singing this time, not voices, a single note, low, deep, resonant. It seemed to vibrate through the wood beneath his feet, as though the building itself was humming. Keller backed toward the doors, his eyes never leaving the altar. The note faded, replaced by silence, so complete it rang in his ears. He stepped outside, closed the doors behind him, and walked away without looking back. But others would hear it too. The following evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, several townsfolk claimed they heard the same hymn drifting from the parish. The church was locked, the yard empty, but the voices were clear, floating over the fields, carrying on air that felt colder than the rest of the night. Each time someone approached the doors, the music would stop. Every time the choir boys were questioned, each swore they had gone straight home after evensong, their parents confirming it. Not one admitted to returning to the church, yet the singing persisted over the next week. It was heard 5 more times, always after dark, always the same 7 voices, always the same hymn, slowed to a pace that left long stretches of silence between each line, and always stopping the moment the sanctuary doors opened. By the 6th night, the townsfolk refused to investigate. They stood at a distance, listening as the voices rose and fell, feeling the cold air drift outward from the churchyard. When Father Alcott was asked about it, his expression remained calm. He said only, "If you hear them, do not enter. They are not meant for you." And he turned away, locking the rectory. Door behind him but the seventh night. It was different. Keller, the sexton, had been ordered to secure the church before dark to ensure no one entered as the sun dipped below the trees. He checked each lock, bolted the doors, and made his way down the road halfway home. The singing began. 7 voices, closer than before, not drifting from the church. This time, from behind him, he turned. Road was empty. The church a distant silhouette against the darkening sky. The voices grew louder. The words now indistinct, more like tones than language. The pauses between each note stretched longer, heavy, almost suffocating Keller Ramby the time he reached his home. The singing had stopped, but he swore he could still hear the faint hum beneath his floorboards as he lay awake that night. The next morning, when the church was opened, something was different. The sanctuary smelled faintly of lily, though no flowers had been placed inside. The candles, though unused, were warm to the touch, as if recently lit, and the footprints were still there. 7 pairs leading from the doors to the altar still. No prints leading back. Keller refused to step inside. He stood in the doorway as Father Alcott examined the scene, the priest's pale fingers tracing the edges of the footprints as though reading something in them. And Alcott looked up, his face unreadable and softly. "Almost too softly to hear," he said. "They're closer now." He ordered the doors barred, told Keller to keep them locked until he returned. Then the priest entered the sanctuary alone, the doors shut behind him, and from outside, Keller swore he heard the faint scrape of stone against stone, like something shifting beneath the altar. Voices did not sing again that night, but those who lived near the parish woke in the early hours, hearts racing, ears straining to catch a sound they couldn't name. Some swore they heard footsteps on the road, others said it was breathing, and by morning, the doors of St. Avitus stood open. The sanctuary was empty, the footprints gone, but on the marble altar, someone or something had left a single handprint, deep into the dust, too large to belong to any of the choir and colder than the stone itself. The night the earth shifted, the sanctuary of St. Avitus was silent. The candles had been snuffed, the pews empty, the air still. The marble altar stood as it always had, pale, cold, immovable outside. The wind rose and fell against the walls. The sound of the trees creaked like whispers. Then, without warning, a tremor rolled through the ground. It wasn't violent, just enough to rattle the windows, to make the wooden beams groan, and to crack the floor beneath the altar. When the tremor passed, the church stood quiet again, but in the sanctuary, a new fissure stretched outward from the marble base, narrow, jagged, splitting the wooden boards in a crooked line. The scent that rose from it was strange. Not earth, not dust, something heavier, damp-like. A place that hadn't seen air in centuries. The first to discover it was Elias Crane, the deacon. He had come early, just after dawn, to prepare for morning mass. He stepped into the sanctuary and felt the cold before he saw the damage. The air near the altar was different still, but with a weight to it, as though the room was holding its breath. When he saw the crack, he froze. It was wide enough to see through beneath the splintered boards. There was a hollow, a cavity that extended far below the church, deeper than the foundation, and in the dim light, something pale sat in the center of Ida's stone coffin, unmarked, no inscription, no symbol, just a rectangular slab of gray, its edges worn smooth, as though it had been there far longer than the church itself. Crane dropped his lantern. The sound echoed, low and hollow, through the pit, and that's when he saw them scratches, faint but deliberate, etched into the stone lid in uneven lines. Not words, just marks clawed, dragged, over and over, until they formed shallow grooves across the surface. Crane stumbled back, his breath catching. He swore he heard something rise from the hollow knot, a sound-day feeling, the sense that something in the air had shifted. Aware of him, he fled, leaving the lantern where it had fallen by noon. Word had reached Father Alcott. The priest arrived without haste. His expression was calm, his movements measured, though his eyes lingered on the fissure longer than usual. He ordered the church sealed until further notice. No one was to enter but him. That evening, 3 workers from the nearest town were summoned. They were instructed to board the sanctuary, to reseal the fissure before morning service. The men, Samuel, Dent among them, the former caretaker who had already left his post, hesitated. None wanted to approach the crack. The air near it was unnaturally cold, colder than the rest of the church, the boards slick with a faint, clammy dampness that clung to their hands. But Alcott stood beside them, watching silent, and they worked. The boards groaned beneath their boots as they pried away the splintered wood, clearing space to lay new planks. Every strike of the hammer echoed louder than it should have, reverberating, as though the hollow beneath was amplifying the sound. And beneath those echoes, something else, a faint, rhythmic scrape like nails dragging against stone. Dent stopped mid-swing, sweat chilling along his spine. Despite the cold, he turned to Alcott, his voice shaking as he asked if the priest had heard it. Alcott's face remained still. "You must not listen," he said quietly, and he gestured for Dent to continue. The work dragged on through the night. The tremors returned twice, faint but enough to rattle the tools, to make the lanterns sway each time. The men paused each time. Alcott whispered the same words, "Keep working." By dawn, the fissure was gone. New boards, cut and fitted, sealed the hollow from view. Altar was reset upon its foundation, its pale marble surface once again unbroken. As if nothing had disturbed it before dismissing the workers, Alcott stepped forward. His voice, calm but colder than usual, filled the still air. "You will not speak of this," he said. Each man nodded, not from obedience, but from something heavier pressure they couldn't explain. And though none of them returned to the parish after that night, not one broke the silence. Dent, weeks later, was overheard in a tavern muttering a single sentence under his breath, his hands trembling around a cup of whiskey. It was breathing down there. No one asked him to explain, because others had begun to feel it too. Those who attended Mass in the days that followed swore the sanctuary felt different, the air thicker, the silence heavier. Some claimed they could hear faint sounds during Alcott's sermons. Not words, not movement, just a low hum, rising from beneath the altar. And though no one dared approach the marble to confirm it, several noticed the candles burning faster, their wax melting in long, thin rivulets, as though the air near the altar was warmer than the rest of the church. But the boards beneath it remained sealed for. Now Father Alcott delivered his homilies with the same calm tone, his hands clasped, his gaze low, but his skin had grown paler, his eyes shadowed by sleeplessness, and his voice, though soft, carried a new weight, as if it was not entirely his own. The coffin remained below, unseen, untouched, yet those who stood in the sanctuary swore they could feel it, not moving, not scraping, just waiting. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the church stood empty, the windows dark, those who lived near St. Avitus swore they could still feel the tremors, subtle, measured, like something beneath the parish was stirring again. And each time the earth shifted, the marble altar creaked, enough to move, just enough to sound. Alive the night of the storm, the parish stood alone against the wind rain, swept across the hillside in heavy, slanting sheets, rattling against the windows, hissing through the trees. The sky above St. Avitus was a dark, roiling gray, split by thin, distant flashes of lightning inside. Only 7 people gathered, 6 parishioners, huddled in the first pew, their faces pale in the dim candlelight, and Father Alcott standing at the altar, his hands clasped, his eyes fixed on the pale slab of marble before him. The sanctuary felt smaller than usual. The shadows clung to the corners, the flickering light making the wooden beams seem to bend and breathe above them. The smell of wet earth drifted through the cracks of the old windows, mingling with the acrid tang of melted wax. The Mass began in whispers. Alcott's voice was low, steady, his words measured, each syllable drawn out to linger in the stillness before the next began. The 6 followed him hesitantly. Their own voices trembled, each prayer echoed, faintly warped, as though the sound wasn't just carried by the room, but by something deeper. And with each prayer, The floor trembled not enough to shake the candles, not enough to rattle the pews, but enough that the congregation felt it in their feet, a pulse-soft rhythmic rising through the boards, timed with the final words of each chant. One parishioner, a farmer named Robert Ein, later told his wife he thought it felt alive, as though the church itself was responding at first. The six said nothing. They glanced at one another in brief, uneasy glances, but none dared interrupt the service. Alcott's tone, calm and unwavering, carried an authority that kept them anchored to their seats. Until the sound began, it came from beneath the altar, faint, metallic scrapes, low, long, deliberate, like stone grinding against stone. The congregation froze. Ein swore later that he heard it shift twice. The first, a sharp drag. The second, a heavier slide, like a lid being pushed open. Inch by inch, no one moved, no one breathed, and through it all, Father Alcott continued. His voice did not falter. He did not look toward the sound. He kept chanting, his eyes fixed on the flickering shadows that danced along the walls. But something wasn't right. The six could feel it. The tremors beneath their feet grew stronger, enough now to make the pews creak softly with each pulse. The air thickened, carrying a faint vibration that buzzed at the edges of their hearing. One woman, Margaret Crow, gripped her rosary so tightly it broke, the beads scattering across the floor. None dared bend to pick them up, and that's when they heard a sound that didn't belong. Not the scrape of stone, not the trembling floor-breathing, slow, deep, not from Alcott, not from the six, from beneath the prayers. Faltered for the first time. Ein lowered his voice to a whisper, his words stumbling as he glanced toward the marble. The candles along the altar flickered, their flames stretching thin, pulled toward the crack at the base, and still Alcott continued. His tone did not change. He raised his voice just slightly. Over the growing hum beneath the boards, the Latin syllables rang louder, sharper, filling every shadowed corner of the sanctuary. As though he was drowning something out, the others sat frozen, their bodies rigid, their eyes fixed on the slab of marble until the second sound came. Not a scrape this time, not 3 times measured, hollow. From beneath the altar, Margaret Crow screamed, the sound sharp and sudden, breaking against the wooden beams. One of the men rose from his seat, stumbling backward toward the doors, but froze when Alcott turned toward them. His face was pale, his voice still steady, and without breaking his chant, he raised a single hand, palm outward, motioning for them to remain seated. None of them left. The storm outside deepened. Rain struck the windows harder. Wind howled through the cracks in the eaves. The church seemed to sway with each gust, the shadows trembling like something alive, and beneath it all, the scraping returned faster this time. Shorter drags, the sound of stone shifting against stone, as though something was pressing upward against the lid. The six clasped their hands, their heads lowered, their lips moving in silence now. None dared raise their voices. None dared meet. Alcott's eyes, because his chanting had changed the words, were still Latin, still measured, but they weren't the words of the Mass anymore. And swore, he heard a name repeated, low and deliberate, woven into the syllables, a name none of them recognized. The tremors intensified, the floorboards creaked. In long, strained groans, dust falling from the rafters above, the candles guttered, one by one, until only a single flame remained on the altar, and through it all, the breathing beneath them grew louder, slow, deliberate, filling the silence between Alcott's chants like a second voice. Then it stopped. The tremors ceased. The scraping ended. The breathing faded into nothing. The six sat frozen, their ears ringing with the absence of sound. The final candle sputtered, its flame thinning to a pale, trembling thread of light. Alcott lowered his hands. For the first time, his voice fell silent. The sanctuary seemed to exhale. The shadows along the walls receded. The air lightened, if only slightly. No one spoke and no one moved until a new sound broke the silence, a crack soft from beneath the altar. Wood this time, not the boards, the marble, a hairline fracture, dark and thin, stretched along the base, splitting wider with a faint, almost wet creak. The 6 scrambled to their feet, bolting for the doors. The storm roared as they fled into the night. Their cries lost to the wind inside. Alcott remained kneeling before the altar, his lips moving in silence now, his eyes fixed on the widening crack. And though the storm raged around the parish, those who lived near the church swore they heard something else carried on the wind that night. Not chanting, not prayer, a voice low deep, whispering from beneath the earth, calling his name. Morning was colder than the day before. Mist clung low too. The ground, wrapping the parish yard in a soft, gray veil. The trees were still, their branches heavy with dew. Even the crows that usually lingered along the stone wall were absent. The first to arrive was Robert N., the farmer who had sat through the storm-lit mass 2 nights prior. He came early, as he always did, to light the candles before morning prayers. But when he reached the doors of St. Avitus, something stopped him. The locket wasn't just bolted, it was latched from the inside. He knocked once. No answer. He tried again. Harder, the sound of his fist against the wood echoed too loudly in the morning stillness. Still, no reply. Anne stepped back, staring at the pale, silent building. The fog seemed heavier around it, pooling at its base as though the earth itself were exhaling. By the time the other parishioners arrived, whispers had already begun. No one had seen Father Alcott since the storm. The rectory windows were dark. The path from his quarters to the church showed no footprints in the wet soil. Something wasn't right. The bell rope hung loose, swaying gently despite the still air, and though no one had touched it, the faintest hum of its tone carried across the yard, as if the sound had been caught and held in the mistine. And 2 others forced the side door first. The wood gave after 3 hard strikes, the sound of splintering echoing through the empty sanctuary. What they found inside was not silence. It was the sound of faint crackling. Dozens of candles, or what remained of them, were scattered across the sanctuary floor. Their wax had melted down to blackened stubs, pooled and hardened into shapes like roots spreading outward from their bases. Each tiny flame still burned, but their light was wrong. It wasn't warm. It was pale, thin, cold, and though the air was still, the flames didn't flicker. The 6 stepped inside cautiously, their boots sticking slightly to the wax that coated the boards. The air smelled strange, not of smoke, not of incense, something sharper, like burned iron and damp earth. At the far end of the sanctuary, the marble altar no longer stood where it had been. It had been moved, pushed several feet forward, gouging deep tracks into the wood beneath it. The effort required to shift it would have been immense. The slab weighed more than any 3 men could lift, yet no tool marks, no rope burns, no evidence of how it had been done could be found behind it. The boards had been torn away. The pit was open again. At its center, the stone coffin, its lid was no longer flush. It had been slid halfway open, exposing a dark gap beneath. No one looked too closely at the gap, not at first there. Attention was fixed on the fact that the air near the coffin was colder than anywhere else in the church, cold enough that their breath came in pale clouds despite the warmth of the season. And yet the candles burned, their flames gave no heat. One man, Elias Crane, the deacon who had first seen the coffin weeks before, stepped closer, his hand instinctively clutching the rosary at his chest. He called Alcott's name softly, the sound brittle in the cavernous space. Only his own echo replied. He turned toward the rectory door. It hung open slightly, the key still in the lock, as though it had been turned and abandoned. But Alcott was nowhere to be found. Not in the church, not in his quarters, nowhere. And that's when Crane noticed something else near the edge of the pit. Along the broken boards, there were marks, not footprints and prints, deep impressions pressed into the wood, each larger than a man's hand. The fingers too long, the nails leaving faint scratches trailing outward toward the edge of the open coffin. The group stepped back as one. None spoke. None wanted to ask what the others were thinking. And swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the open gap in the coffin lid. The darkness there seemed unnatural, deeper than shadow, as though it swallowed the flicker of the candles entirely. And then they heard a sound so faint They almost mistook it for the creak of the building, a slow, steady rhythm breathing deep from below. The six froze, their bodies rigid, their ears straining against the silence. The breath was deliberate, each exhale like a faint rush of wind, rising through the gap, and then layered beneath it. Another sound, a voice not loud, not clear, just a whisper, each word too soft to decipher, each syllable stretched and drawn, as though carried from a great distance. But one thing they were certain of, the voice wasn't Alcott's grain, backed away slowly. His rosary slipping from his hand, the beads scattered across the wax-streaked floor, rolling toward the pit, one by one, before settling at its edge. The six didn't speak again. They left the sanctuary, their movements slow, deliberate, as though any sudden motion might draw attention. They barred the doors behind them, nailing the planks into place, though none could explain why, as they stepped back into the fog and turned one last time toward the parish. The windows reflected no light, though the candles still burned within, and faintly, almost too faintly to believe, he swore he saw the marble altar shift just slightly, as if something beneath had moved. Again by that evening, word spread Father Alcott was gone. The church was sealed, and though the doors were barred, several villagers swore they saw light flickering through the windows at night, not the warm, golden glow of flame, but the same cold, pale light, always moving, always circling the altar. And on the third night, as the mist rolled down from the hillside, several claimed they heard the bell ring, not the bright, high tone of morning, a single low chime rising from beneath the earth. The parish stood silent. Weeks had passed since Father Alcott vanished, but the air around St. Avitus still felt heavier than the rest of the hillside. The fog lingered longer here, clinging to the foundation stones, seeping through the cracks in the boarded windows. The diocese sent word quietly there would be no investigation. The church was to be declared structurally unsafe, the sanctuary sealed, the altar left untouched. The order came with no ceremony, no rites, just a small crew of men in dark coats, arriving before dawn to nail the doors shut and hammer iron brackets across the entrances. They moved quickly, their boots thudding softly against the wet soil, their hammers striking the wood with sharp, hollow notes that carried down the empty road. None of them entered the sanctuary, not once the instructions were clear. Seal the parish, do not look beneath the altar, do not speak of what is below by nightfall. The church was entombed. Boards covered the doors and windows, iron chains wrapped tight around the gates. A heavy wooden sign was staked into the mud, its black letters declaring the building condemned, unfit for entry. But something wasn't right. The villagers who lived closest to the grounds swore they felt the change almost immediately. The silence around the parish deepened. The wind seemed to die whenever it passed the church, the trees stilling as though the air itself was holding back. And in that stillness, they began to hear it. The first time came 3 nights after the sealing, a distant chime, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the mist. It was the bell's slow, low one, heavy toll. Then silence, but the bell had been removed years earlier. The old steeple stood empty, its frame hollow, the rope long since taken down. There was nothing there to ring yet. The sound carried, some said it came from beneath the hill, as if the earth itself was resonating. Others swore they could feel it more than hear it, a soft vibration in the soil that traveled through their feet, up their bones, settling in their chest each time it came. It struck only once, never a sequence, never a pattern, just a solitary toll, heavy and deliberate, before fading back into the mist. At first, the locals tried to dismiss it. They told themselves it was the wind, the shifting of old beams, the echo of something distant, carried strangely by the fog. But each time it happened, the air grew colder, even in the warmth of late spring. Their breath would cloud faintly when the bell sounded, and each time it seemed to come closer. One evening, Margaret Crow, the same woman who had dropped her rosary during Alcott's final mass, claimed she woke to the sound of the chime just outside her window. Her home sat nearly half a mile from the parish. She swore the vibration rattled the glass, the faintest tremor shaking the wooden frame of her bed when she looked outside. The fog was thick, no shapes, no figures, but she thought she saw a faint glow on the hill pale like candlelight circling where the altar would have stood. And that's when she heard it, not the chime, voice low drawn out calling her name she did not open. Her window, she did not leave her bed by morning. She refused to speak of it again. Others claimed similar things in the weeks that followed. The chime sounding closer, the faint, cold light glowing in the distance. The low hum of voices carried on the wind, too soft to make out, too deliberate to ignore the diocese, sent no one back. The parish remained sealed, the boards weathering slowly in the rain, the sign tilting in. The mud as the hillside eroded, but at night, the sound carried the bell that no longer existed one deep toll. Then silence, and those who heard it swore. The ground seemed to breathe afterward, slow, subtle rise and fall beneath their feet, as though something deep below was stirring by the time summer came. Many families had left the area. The homes nearest the hill were abandoned, their shutters nailed shut, their windows coated in a thin layer of dust. The church stood alone, its dark silhouette rising from the fog each night still silent, except when the bell tolled. Some say the sound is louder now, not every night, not at the same time, but when it comes. The air grows colder, the mist thicker, the world holding its breath, until the chime fades back into the earth, and each time, those who remain swear they can feel it more clearly, not just in the ground, but beneath it, deeper moving, waiting, and the altar, unseen for months, sealed away behind boards and chains, seems to shift slightly each time, not enough to be heard, just enough to be felt, like a faint exhale rising through the soil, a reminder that the parish, though sealed, is not silent, not entirely, because something beneath St. Avitus still listens and still waits. For what? No one dares to ask, but each time the bell tolls, those who hear it swear. It's one toll closer to being answered. The parish stands behind a chain-link fence. Now the gate is rusted shut, the lock corroded, its metal streaked with long trails of orange, where the rain has run down. Weeds and thorns crawl along the lower links, gripping the fence like skeletal fingers, their leaves brittle from the cold air that seems to hang around the hill, no matter the season. Building itself is a hollowed, husk-stained glass windows, once bright with depictions of saints, are shattered. Only fragments remain in their lead frames, jagged shards catching the light like dull, broken teeth. The wooden doors are blackened from weather and rot, their surfaces warped, as though something beneath the grain is pushing outward. The sign warning trespassers still hangs near the gate, its letters faded, the wood warped from rain. But people still come, not to pray, not to restore. They come to listen. Paranormal investigators, carrying their cameras and meters, wait until the sun dips below the ridge. They speak softly, even to one another, their voices subdued as though the air itself presses down on them. They climb through the gap in the fence, and they step into the silence. The closer they get to the sanctuary, the heavier it feels. The air grows colder, not with the breeze. There is none, but with something still and stale, a weight that clings to the lungs. Some say they can feel it underfoot, a faint, subtle pulse in the soil like a slow breath, rising and falling, just beneath the earth. But something wasn't right each time they reached the broken doors. Their equipment spikes, the EMF meters flicker erratically, their lights pulsing not in random bursts, but in a rhythm, a slow, deliberate cadence like the pace of something alive inside. The sanctuary is worse. The floorboards are warped, sagging slightly toward the center, as though the ground beneath has shifted over the years. The scent of mold lingers, mixed with the faint metallic tang of rust, though no metal lies in sight. And at the far end, the altar still there, still intact, though cracked along its base. It leans slightly now, a marble slab at an unnatural angle, as if the ground beneath continues to sink. The air around it is colder still, cold enough to cloud breath even in the height of summer. Every group that has entered reports the same thing. Murmurs. They do not begin immediately. The first few minutes are only silence, broken by the creak of floorboards and the distant calls of crows beyond the shattered windows. But as soon as the investigators approach the altar, the sound begins faint at first, a low, rhythmic murmur, like distant chanting heard through walls. And then, the words always the same in Latin, "It is not empty." The first time it was captured, many believed it was interference, a voice from a nearby broadcast, a trick of wind through the cracked walls. The recording showed no interference. The voice was deep, resonant, and when isolated, it was not just one voice. It was several layered together, all repeating the same phrase. It is not empty. The investigators always leave quickly after the murmurs begin. Some say the sound grows louder if they linger, as though aware of their presence. Others swear the air itself begins to vibrate, faintly at first, then strong enough to rattle the metal components of their equipment. That's when they hear a second sound. Not always, not every visit, but when it comes. They do not stay long. The scraping from beneath the altar, slow, measured like stone, shifting against stone, deep below the cracked marble. Those who have heard it describe the same thing afterward. The way the air seemed to constrict, the shadows along the walls stretching toward the center of the room. The sense that every breath they took was no longer their own. No one remains long enough to confirm what moves below. No one touches the altar, and none of the investigators return a second time. One group, who left in such haste they abandoned part of their equipment, claimed something followed them to the edge of the fence. Not footsteps, not a figurey sound, a single low chime like a bell close enough to feel in their bones. But the church's bell is gone. The steeple has been empty for years today. The parish remains behind the fence, its silhouette black against the gray sky, the shards of stained glass catching what little light the overcast morning allows. Most who pass by avoid even glancing at it, but those who stop, even for a moment, swear they can feel it, that faint pulse beneath the ground, that quiet, measured breath. And if they listen long enough, just beyond the whisper of wind through the broken windows, they hear it too, the murmured chant, low and steady, carried through the hollow sanctuary like a prayer for no one. It is not empty, always the same, never louder, never softer, just constant, as though whatever lies beneath the altar isn't waiting anymore. It's simply reminding anyone who draws near that it's still there, and that the grave still breathes. The parish has no power. The lines were cut years ago, the fuse box stripped bare, the wires pulled from the walls when the diocese sealed the building. The sanctuary should be dark, lifeless, nothing but a husk of rotting wood and cold marble under the weight of decades. But on some nights, it isn't. From the road below the hill, drivers have reported seeing the windows glow, a soft, pale light flickering faintly through the shattered stained glass. It isn't the warm hue of candles. It isn't the steady white of modern bulbs. It is colder, dimmer, a light that doesn't seem to reach far, as though it shines only within the church, never spilling past the windows. Some have pulled over to watch. They say the glow pulses slowly like a breath, but something wasn't right. When the light appears, there is sound, faint but distinct, the cadence of a voice echoing through the empty sanctuary, deep, measured, and calm, a priest's voice each time. Those who stop to listen swear they hear the same words, carried faintly on the still night air. Body of Christ, given for you. Then a pause, a low murmur, like a congregation whispering its reply, and then again, blood of Christ, shed for you. The voice is patient, rhythmic like a mass, but the church is sealed. The boards remain nailed over the doors. Chains still hang from the gates, their locks rusted solid. The windows, though broken, are too narrow for anyone to enter without leaving clear evidence. And yet, each time the lights appear, the voice continues, measured, calm, as if someone is conducting the service inside a place no one can reach. Those who approach the hill swear the air changes when the voice begins. The fog grows denser, rolling low over the ground, muffling sound until the only thing audible is the faint intonation from within the parish. And that's when they hear it, not just the priest, just the murmurs of response, but another sound beneath it all, the faint toll of a bell slow, deliberate rising from somewhere below the altar each time. It rings only once, then the voice resumes calm, steady, never faltering. Some have dared to climb the hill during these nights. Though few make it past the gate, they describe the temperature dropping as they approach, the fog clinging to their clothes. Heavy and wet, their breath visible even in the warmth of summer. Those who linger near the fence say the voice grows louder, not shouting, never urgent, but closer, as though the priest is walking the length of the sanctuary, moving from pew to pew, speaking to those who are not there. And then, the sound changes, a shift so subtle, it almost goes unnoticed. The murmurs grow softer, the priest's words become slower, until there is silence, a long, heavy pause, and then the faint scrape of something solid, deep beneath the altar stone, against stone always. Slow, always deliberate, no one waits. Long after that, by morning, the glow is gone, the windows dark, the fog lifted, but there is always something new inside each time the lights return. When the voice is heard and the bell tolls, a bouquet of lily appears on the altar, fresh white, marked by the dust that coats. Every other surface, the doors remain sealed, the boards unbroken, the locks untouched, and yet, without fail, the lily are there. Some say they carry no scent, others claim the fragrance is overpowering, sweet to the point of nausea. But all who have seen them agree on one thing: they are fresh, never wilted, as if someone placed them there that very morning. And though no one admits it openly, many in the nearby village believe the services are not for the living, that the priest's voice, calm and measured, is not meant for the ears of those outside the fence, and that each bouquet is not an offering for the congregation, but for something beneath the altar, something that still breathes each night. The lights appear. Fewer locals are willing to come close. Some say they have begun to hear their names spoken, whispered faintly from the sanctuary when they linger too long at the fence. Others claim the toll of the bell feels different, now heavier, closer, as if whatever lies beneath has drawn nearer to the surface. The diocese has issued no statement. The fence remains. The boards hold. But the lights continue, the voice continues, and each bouquet of lily is fresher than the last. No one knows when the next Mass will be or who it will be for, but the villagers have begun to mark the nights when the glow appears, and some have noticed a pattern each time the lily appear. There is one more stem than the last, one more flower, as if the congregation is growing, and with each new bloom, those who hear the voice swear it is speaking a little louder, a little clearer, closer, as though the next Mass will not be held behind boards and chains, but out in the open for all to hear, and maybe for all to attend, even those who never meant to, especially them, because when the bell tolls again, no one is certain it will stop at one. Some say Father Alcott was buried with what he feared most. Others believe he was taken by it. Either way, the altar still waits for the next Mass.